I was scheduled to talk about three things today. One is shifted to next week, that is environmental productivity. It fits better in next week's lecture anyway. One is the environmental goodness curve, and one is environmental justice, and I'm going to talk mostly about environmental justice. There are videos on the environmental goodness curve that you can watch. It's relatively straightforward material. You sort of see it in this picture here. The theory, going back to Grossman and Kruger, the late Alan Kruger, who you see here, is that very poor societies put little pressure on the environment. Then as societies grow richer, they put more pressure on the environment, but then as they grow richer still, they put less pressure on the environment again. That is the theory. It sort of intuitively holds if we're talking about pollution that is directly associated with industry. In agricultural societies, there is no industry. In service societies, there's very little industry, so it makes sense. It doesn't hold in general. There's pressures on the environment are multifaceted. There's all sorts of different pollutants around that all respond very differently to this. So empirically, you would not find this. Another thing you would not find is that this curve is sort of stable over time, even where for certain pollutants you can find it. It is different in different decades, it's different in different parts of the world. So it's a nice theory, it just doesn't stand up. The most important thing here, and Alan Kruger used to make fun of environmental economists, that even though he was a labor economist, his most cited paper is in environmental economics. You silly environmentalist, is what he used to add in his mind, right? This is a purely descriptive analysis. Kruger is of course famous for his part in the credibility revolution, where economics shifted from correlations to causal estimates. These estimates that Kruger came up with are purely correlational, descriptive. It is not the case that we put less pressure in the environment because we grow richer. It's because we get fed up with a dirty environment and demand action and take action against it. It's not because we're richer, it's because we don't like a dirty environment. This notion that there is this relationship between per capita income and environmental pollution that has been found sometimes over time and between countries also holds within countries. And that is an important thing to keep in mind, that not everybody puts the same sort of pressure on the environment. And this is one of the earlier illustrations here by Matt Kahn, where he looks at the CO2 emissions from transport, from commuting essentially, and plots that by household income. Now what you see is that there's a relationship, and the relationship is that poor households put a lot of pressure on the environment, emit a lot of CO2 while commuting, and rich households do, but in between households do far less. And the explanation that he finds in the rest of the paper, this is just a graph to set up the research and motivate the analysis, is that poorer people drive older cars, and they tend to be less fuel efficient and therefore emit more CO2, whereas richer people tend to drive much more and tend to drive much heavier cars and therefore emit more CO2. And then the in-between households are somewhere in between and emit less. Now, this particular relationship that you see here is very specific to the United States. If we do this in other countries, then we find that poorer people don't drive at all, but take the bus instead, right? and you see an almost linear increase in CO2 emissions per commute plotted against income. But in the US, this is the case. One explanation that is true in some parts of the US is that in the very rich enclaves, rich people live close to their work, but then all the people who do the menial work for them, the cleaners, live far, far away from their work and actually commute very long distances, and that has to do with house prices. So there is a relationship, obviously, between how much pressure you put on the environment and how rich you are, but it's a complicated one, right? Here is another example, closer to home. This is from Ireland, the Republic. What it shows here is how different types of households put different pressure on the environment. And what we're looking at here are carbon monoxide emissions. So not CO2, but CO. And you see all sorts of things going on. Rural households versus urban households, you see big differences. And then the second group of results is by income decile, from the very poorest to the very richest. Then the next group of results is by household size. Then household composition, and finally whether or not there are disabled people in the household, and if so, how many. The dark blue are the emissions directly in the household. So this is the emissions from the appliances that people use. And the reason that the rural comes up so much higher than the urban is lawnmowers. Lawnmowers emit a lot of carbon monoxide. Not that bad because it's out in the open. Typically don't go mow your lawn inside. So it sort of wafts away. It's not that serious, but that is where the carbon monoxide comes from. The poorer households tend to have older appliances, and as appliances get older, and particularly if they're not so well maintained, they start emitting more carbon monoxide, because this is essentially incomplete combustion where it comes from. It's carbon monoxide per person, and there are economies of scale in a household. So if you heat your home, you have heated your home, and it doesn't matter whether there's one person there or 5 people, right? Actually, you need slightly less heat for 5 people because our bodies radiate heat. So on a per capita basis, heating is much more efficient if you live with a large family or something, right? So per person you emit more, and that is what you see displayed there. So those are the blue bars. The dark blue bars easily explained by behavior, if you know where carbon monoxide comes from. The light blue bars are the indirect emissions. Those are not the emissions that originate in the household, but the emissions that originate from the purchases that that household makes, right? And then the emissions are elsewhere in the economy. And if you again focus on the income deciles, you see that richer households buy more stuff and therefore emit more carbon monoxide in the rest of the economy, right? So it's again a fairly complex relationship. This is something that we should just be aware of, right? That it's important for your projections of where will emissions go. It's important if you want to assign blame, which some people want to do. It's also important if you're considering policy, because if there were a tax on carbon monoxide emissions, which is unlikely because you can't monitor carbon monoxide, but suppose that we were to put a tax on carbon monoxide, this graph immediately tells you who would be in first instance paying the bills, right? And what you see is that there's actually not a big difference between rich and poor in the amount of CO that they emit. And therefore a carbon monoxide tax would fall equally roughly on rich and poor, and therefore much more heavily on the poor relative to their income, right? So it's important to keep these sort of things in mind. Concern about who suffers from environmental pollution, and that's one thing I forgot to say. Carbon dioxide gets in the atmosphere and changes the climate for everybody, right? So it doesn't actually matter for the consequences who emits. Carbon monoxide is much more local. So it is the poor who suffer from carbon monoxide poisoning in their house. The carbon monoxide that is in your house will not poison the neighbors, right? It will poison you. So it's not just that rich and poor have or cause the problem differentially. It's also the case that they suffer the consequences differently, right? That is what I forgot to say. So different people put different pressure on the environment, different people suffer different environmental consequences. But concerns about environmental justice do not stop here. For those of you who are easily triggered, a lot of what is to come shows clear signs of racism, right? Last Thursday and Friday we talked about sexism and the environment, or discrimination along gender and sex lines. I'm going to talk about race for the next, so if you're very sensitive, then yeah, beware. What you're looking at here is for the United States, concentrations of PM2.5. PM is particulate matter, so these are just fine particles. 2.5 stands for 2.5 microns. That's micron is 1 millionth of a meter, if I'm not mistaken. Very fine particles. The reason that we're concerned about this is that they are so fine that they just go through your skin. Your skin does not stop these things, and they get into your organs, do damage there. They actually physically tear up cells. They also get into your brain. Even your brain membrane isn't tight enough to keep them out, and they directly interfere with the neuron activity in your brain. And it has been shown that PM2.5, high PM2.5 concentrations, for instance, reduces the performance of students during exams. This is not a concern for Sussex, because the air here is typically very clean, but it has been shown that in an unnamed university in London, it is a concern, and concentrations are actually very uneven across campus. And if you're unlucky enough to take your exam in the dirty part of campus, you likely drop from a first to a 2-1, or for a 2-1 to a 2-2. And you can calculate what are the implications for lifetime earnings, right? This is going to cost you. And for that reason, we are not allowed to name this university, right? Because otherwise the students could sue them. So that is why we worried about PM2.5. It causes all sorts of health problems as well as cognition problems. What you see is, over the years, we're looking at the United States, the PM2.5 concentrations have fallen steadily over time, so that is good. The line in the middle is the mean concentration, and then we're also looking at the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. These things vary over time quite a bit. It has to do with the weather and everything. Now look at this map. This is the change in the percentile rank So this is essentially, were you the dirtiest part at the beginning versus are you the dirtiest part at the end of the sample, and how did your position in this ranking change? In blue, we're looking at those areas where particular concentrations fell, and in the orange, brown, we're looking at areas where the concentration rose. And partly this is just the remake of US economic geography. The Rust Belt going into relative decline, and the Sun Belt prospering mightily. And a lot of this has to do with relocation of industry, also to do with the relocation of traffic. But if you know your economic geography of the United States, you also have some idea of what does this imply for who is affected by this, right? Because the black population is still very much concentrated in the South. The Hispanic population is very much concentrated in the south of the United States, right? And that is what Colmer and co-authors were interested in. So in the graph I first showed, I'm just looking at the overall trend. The graph I'm showing now, see the same thing for areas that are disproportionately black, areas that are disproportionately white. So that's the top graph, and the top line is the black ones, and the bottom line is the non-black ones. Similarly, the middle graph is for the Hispanics, where the top graph again is where there's lots of Hispanics, and the bottom graph is where there not so much. And the bottom graph does the same thing, but now with poor versus non-poor. And you see that there's actually no gap there, right? In the top graph and the middle graph, particularly in the top graph, there is a clear gap between the black areas and the white areas. There's a less pronounced gap for the Hispanic areas and the non-Hispanic areas. But there's no gap for rich versus poor areas anymore, or at all. So this seems to be a race issue rather than an income issue. And then, of course, it's a scientific paper, so you need to run your regressions, and lo and behold, the picture that you see in the graphs also shows up at the regressions, and that is what you see in table S2. That correlates of rank change, that the black share of the population, still cannot point, the black share of the population, the initial black share of the population is irrelevant, but the white share of the population, this one here, is negative and significant. So it's not so much that the blacks were disadvantaged, it's more that the whites were advantaged, right? Outcome is the same, right? Hispanics have a positive share. So if you were in an originally Hispanic area, your rank went up, your affair got relatively dirtier. And the same is if we do not look at the initial condition, but we look at the change in the characteristics. A very similar pattern shows up. So there's more going on here than just income, right? That's the message of this. These are two maps of Houston, Texas. This is just graphical information. At the top, you're looking at where is waste processed in the city. Where are the waste facilities for incineration and storage and those sort of things. In the bottom map, you're looking at where do the minorities live. And again, the paper continues and runs the regressions and finds, yes, this is statistically significant, but I don't need to bore you with that, right? This is a striking study, and it requires some explanation because there's all sorts of things going on. At the top, we're in Richmond. It's Oregon, right? But don't cite me on that. We're in Richmond. In the top, so top right, you're looking at the urban heat island effect. If you have a large concentration of buildings and machinery and those sort of things and people, things get hotter. And that is what you see in the top right. The top left, you're looking at those areas in the city that were redlined in the 1930s. Now this is hard to imagine what happened here. Essentially, urban planners drew essentially areas on the map and said these are suitable for investment by the city, and these are recommended for investment by private actors, and the other areas, the so-called redlined areas shown here in red, are not suited for investment. And this was the 1930s, and essentially they looked at the color of the skin of the people who lived there. So the black areas were said not suitable for investment, and the other areas were. This was done in the 1930s, right? And the other maps are all 2018, something like that. So the next one shows the average temperature by polygon, and then the picture next to it, the bar charts, take the average and so on of that with the same color coding as in the top left, right? So what you see is that the redlined areas are hotter. So if you're worried about the impacts of heat waves, and heat waves does severe damage to the health of very old people and very young people, and the in-between people simply cannot put in as much work if it's very hot, right? Because your body grows so very tired. So this is a concern, right? And immediately goes into health effects, immediately goes into productivity, and therefore the wage that you earn, right? So differences in temperature between the areas that were redlined over almost a century ago, right? Next picture is tree cover. Where are the trees in Richmond? Well, they're all in the green parts of town, and very few in the red parts of town, right? Why is tree cover important? Well, it actually makes the neighborhood nicer. It sort of increases the value of the houses. It also filters out a lot of air pollutants, right? So that is actually not shown on this graph, but trees are actually good at taking air pollution out of the air. And then finally, impervious surface. And what you see there is that that is again not higher in the redlined areas. Now this is, you can see this as where are the parks, where are the trees, where are the parks, right? There's a negative correlation there, obviously. But also impervious surfaces are important for flood risks. If you live in an area that is mostly concrete and asphalt, the water has nowhere to go and will flood your basement. If you live in an area where there's lots of green space, that sort of acts as a sponge for the water, and you're much less susceptible to floods than if you live in a hardened area. And all this goes back to historical racism, right? This is no two ways about this. This was outright racism in the 1930s. The reason for this is manifold. And actually, I'm doing this lecture at the moment. There is another video on campus where a guy who is much more appropriate to talk about this subject essentially tells the same story, but now with exposure to certain chemicals and how that varies between different groups in society. So part of this is income, and part of it is something else, as I think the PM 2.5 graphs showed. And one of the reasons is political representation and political enfranchisement, and that I got that word all wrong. If you're going to cite something hazardous, if you have, say, a facility that burns waste, where are you going to put it? Are you going to put it in Kingston or in Lewis, where you have lots of well-educated, well-connected people? Or are you going to put it in New Haven, where people are less well represented and a lot poorer? Now, where do we incinerate waste in Sussex? In New Haven, not in Lewis, right? Bloody ugly, but it's also not good for the people who live near it, because stuff comes out of incinerators, right? If you're going to site a waste facility, I showed that map for Houston, where are you going to put it? Where the poor people are, where the people are who do not vote, who do not get onto the city council, and so on and so forth, right? Who do not have rich business friends or people or connections in the media, right? That is where you're gonna put your dirty facilities. There is a feedback loop there, and we talked about that before last Thursday. No, the Thursday before that, somebody in the seminar did not know where is the South Downs National Park, right? Also known as like 100 meters that way, right? Is where it starts. So I showed you this picture for the hedonic house pricing study, and actually it matters if you live in a national park. Then your house sells for almost 10,000 pounds more. If you live in the green belt, then the premium on your house is 6,000 pounds. Right? So there's two things here. One, this is the UK. So if you have a friend in the House of Lords who can designate your area to be in the green belt or in the national park, in a national park, then that's actually very good for your wealth, right? So the citing of these things, where do we actually put these? It's essentially arbitrary where you draw the boundary, right? But it has big consequences for the people who live there. So that is one thing. But the other thing is, of course, that in the nice areas, house prices are high. So that is where the rich people go to live, right? Because the poor people can't afford to buy a house in Dartmoor, or for that matter, in the South Downs National Park, right? House prices are much higher here and here than here. So if you are low on income, where do you go? Away from the rich areas, right? Or if you're a migrant into this country, where do you end up? Where houses are cheap, right? Not where houses are expensive. And that, of course, then reinforces the mechanism, right? So rich people concentrate in the clean areas. Rich people tend to be better connected, better at talking, better at writing to the newspaper, may have well-connected friends or very powerful friends, who then further protect them. And you sort of have this self-reinforcing mechanism where environmental hazards are concentrated in certain areas, where the poor and poorly represented are, right? Sometimes that is very explicit. This is a chemical plant that caught fire after Hurricane Laura. I think this was last year. And in a related comment, Mustafa Ali, who used to work for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, admitted that we have sacrifice zones across the Gulf Coast. There are communities of color and lower wealth communities that are often pushed into the most dangerous locations through redlining, through restrictive covenants, and through zoning practices. And it's not so much what he says in the second sentence, that there are these communities, but what he says in the first sentence. These are sacrifice areas. Right? They are not our priority if something goes wrong. So, one implication is that therefore the incidence of environmental policy is very different for different groups. You're looking here at London. On the left, you're looking at air. No, you're looking at noise. At the right, you're looking at deprivation scores. The redder it is, the darker it is, the worse it gets. So that is noise. And this is air pollution, NO2 and PM10, slightly larger particles. And what you see is, did I say noise? I mean NO2, right? What you see is that this is essentially the transport network in London, right? Is where the air pollution is. And if you plot then air pollution against income, then indeed you find that poorer areas are dirtier than richer areas. Now that immediately implies as well that if you do something against this, then you disproportionately benefit the poor, right? And that is what you see in the bottom graph. It's the change. It's the change in air pollution, but it's not the change in air pollution, it's actually the health impact. And that is measured here in years of life gained per 100,000 people. And that actually is higher in poorer areas than in richer areas. And that is because the problem is bigger, right? So when Ken Livingstone, when he was still in our good graces, did this, he actually, as a communist should, helped the poor, right? So that by now it's a very complicated story, right? There's all sorts of moving parts, and that is because it's a complicated story. The complication doesn't stop here. I don't know whether this is going to work. No, this is not going to work. It should start this video, but it doesn't. It does. It just takes forever. Yay! I don't know why it takes so long. Okay, now it's loaded the video, so now I can play it.
Ein schöner Land in dieser Zeit. Es regt sich Aufbruch weit und breit. Auf neue Wege lebendig stehen.
In dieser Zeit
You guys had enough?
Müssen unsere Erde warm. Gesehen wird, dass wir so.
Okay, what was this? It goes on for another 3 minutes. I'm gonna spare you that. So what did we just hear, right? We heard a song in German, a bad song, sung badly. This, you can sort of dismiss this as this was part of the election campaign of the Greens in the 2021 election of the Greens, and they were just having a bit of fun, right? And you can sort of like dismiss this like, yeah, they did a gimmick for the election. Why would I show you this, apart from to test your taste in music and your ears? Actually, it's a very significant song. The tune that they picked was, they changed the lyrics. You don't know, but they changed the lyrics, right? The tune that they picked is For Kein Schöner Land, No Land as Pretty, which was a nationalistic song. Essentially, it said Germany is prettier than Poland, Germany is prettier than France, right? This was the start of the nationalistic movement in Germany. This was the anthem of the Wandervogel, which large parts of the Wandervogel ended up in the Nazi Party later. This was the start of National Socialism in Germany around this bloody song, and who picks it? The Greens, and they revived the song, right? So this is serious symbolically, I would think, and this sort of attitude is actually very widespread. Late last week, Prince William, second in line to the throne, said we should not be having so many children. And really what he said is, you people in Africa should not be having so many children. It's bad for the environment, right? For destroying wildlife in Africa. And people picked up on the hypocrisy of a guy with 3 kids, 3 recognized kids, to go after other people for having kids. But there's also racist overtones here, right? It's the people in Africa who should stop having kids, not us people in England. And Prince William definitely is not alone. You all have heard of WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, was created by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. And you think that the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, was bad, right, for being a grumpy old racist. Bernhard was part of the Hitlerjugend, right? And he was not the only founder of the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The other founder was Anton Rupert, who played a big part in the Afrikaner Broederbond, which was the grassroots organization behind the National Party in South Africa. These are the guys who created apartheid. They funded the Worldwide Fund for Nature. And the express purpose of the early days of the Worldwide Fund for Nature was to preserve the hunting grounds of the European elite, the African hunting grounds of the European elite, to make sure that the locals would not get in there and convert these lands to agriculture or things like that. That was the express purpose. Now this is, you may say, is a long time ago, right? This is the 1950s and the 1960s. What are you talking about? But WWF has kept this up, right? They often pick nature conservation over local development, and that has gotten into allegations of the abuse of rights and cover up of this abuse, up to violence against, physical violence, not just denying them their lands, but actively beating them up. Now, to round up, this would be better if I had done the environmental goodsnets curve first. there is now a significant sub-part of ecological economics where people are arguing for degrowth. And degrowth is just an ugly neologism, right? It's a new word. Essentially what they mean is shrink, right? The opposite of growth is not degrowth, the opposite of growth is shrink. And there's a significant movement of academics who argue that the only solution to environmental problems is to shrink the economy. Which is a very strange thing to say when you realize that so many people in the world, and particularly people with a darker complexion than I have, are living in abject poverty, right? It is a very peculiar thing to say. That is what we need to do. So, this is all very confusing, right? There's many moving parts, that people with different income, but also people of different ethnicity put different pressures on the environment for reasons that we part understand, and there may also be other things going on that we don't fully understand. And it can move this way, it can move the other way. By implication, environmental policy also can have positive effects on poorer people, can have more negative effects on poorer people. And then on top of all that, we have an environmental movement that, while most environmentalists are absolutely lovely people, also has this history and continued overtones of racism, right? So, I don't know what to make of this. I do think it's important that you know about these things and can reasonably argue about these things. Whether it is a simple message, I don't believe so, and I don't think this message should be simplified in any way.